Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK, and today we're taking a close look at ESG. Of course, that's environmental, social and governance, as I'm sure you all know, in the second Trump era. The president's disdain for environmental policies is no secret. More than 100 environmental regulations were rolled back in his first term and more planned this time around. And his dislike for diversity, equity and inclusion is also well documented. We looked at the DEI rollback for big companies in a podcast last month, and today we're broadening it out to ESG as a whole, and also touching on Trump's tariffs and the impending trade war and what it all means for comms. So we have two special guests to pick through all these big themes. Mo Hussein is President UK Public and Government Affairs at Edelman. Welcome, Mo. Great to have you here. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me. Hi.
So also joining us is Andrew Adie, Managing Director, Strategy and Corporate Communications, Head of Purpose and Sustainability at SEC Newgate. Welcome, Andrew. Hope you're doing well.
Thank you. I am.
Good. Well, thank you again, both of you, for taking part. Plenty to discuss. I'm going to go straight into it. I think we should start really with the E in ESG. How seriously do you think companies are really scaling back their environmental and sustainability commitments in the Trump era? And what would you say your view is of how they're communicating it? Who'd like to start on this?
I'm happy to jump in. Look, I think they're taking it pretty seriously, especially if it's in the form of an executive order or a regulation, then you need to comply with it. And even recently, we've seen, I think just a few days ago, there was a US energy CEOs meeting in Houston where President Trump's rhetoric was openly embraced by companies who previously had been championing their ESG credentials. So there is definitely a shift towards that scaling back. But then on the flip side, there are clearly longer term implications that need to be thought about, whether it's regulatory challenges in other markets or global competitiveness or even reduced investor interest. So I think this kind of rub about balancing short-term policy shifts, and let's see how short-term they may be, and enduring sustainability trends to maintain resilience, I think matters. And I think the key thing for me is language. Language matters a lot here. You're already hearing a lot less about energy transition and a lot more about energy dominance and energy abundance. And I think you'll probably hear companies who are trying to navigate this really challenging and difficult fine line, particularly with the huge US exposure, having to talk about more about things like clean air and clean water, perhaps over green and sustainability.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? And word that springs to mind is net zero, and that's obviously something that we have heard a huge amount of in recent years. Do you think that is also one that we could be hearing a lot less of in this term?
Yeah, definitely. And look, I don't think that is confined to the US either. It feels like other countries, the UK as well, with the cost of living crisis and public just feeling generally the pinch. So the cost of net zero is a big debating point. You've just heard Kemi Badenoch, leader of the opposition, talking about net zero and kind of moving away from the 2050 target, even though it was a Conservative government that put it in to law in the first place. So I think this is a global trend, but it seems to be exacerbated in the US by the current administration.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Andrew, what's your take on this? Do you have any sort of particular views of how this sort of rollback and sort of balancing act is being communicated?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult time for corporates at the moment. I think many corporates will be slightly reeling from what's going on and sort of trying to feel their way through it. I mean, I think how they respond really depends on the target audiences that are their main stakeholders. So, I mean, we've seen a lot of oil and gas companies rolling back net zero commitments. And to be honest, that probably isn't a massive surprise because there's always a question mark about just how committed they were in the first place. But I think a lot of businesses, particularly ones that have consumer industry target audiences, those in transport, EVs, renewable energy, they will not be rolling back in the same way, although I totally agree with Mo that they are definitely changing their narrative around it at the moment. And I think one of the the really tricky things for businesses, regardless of what the Conservatives have said today, is that net zero by 2050 is still a statutory requirement in the UK. You've still got 143 other countries around the world that have got net zero pledges. You've still got about 200 countries around the world that are still signed up to the Paris Agreement, regardless of Trump pulling the US out. So actually, while many corporates may be trying to read the room and maybe trying to change their narrative around it, the regulatory and the statutory framework in which they operate probably hasn't fundamentally changed. And I think the advice that we are giving clients at the moment is you have to see through 5-year political terms. And this sort of populist movement is probably going to be a longer term thing than just a 5-year term. But, how our corporate reputation is going to be judged in 10, 20, 30 years' time, when there are sea level rises, when we are seeing climate-led migration, when we are seeing supply chain changes, when we're seeing businesses having to reformulate their products, the lens on which public opinion is based at that point will be very different. And I think corporates that have rolled back and dropped everything will find it very hard to regain trust and step back in again once they've made that decision.
It's a really good point. I mean, no pun intended, but it does seem a bit like turning around an oil tanker when it comes to the challenges of environmental regulation and changing them and developing them and indeed rolling them back. So it's a fair point, and the sort of political climate does change, and that's something that all big companies need to be aware of. Mo, what do you think, if you kind of noticed any particular changes based on geographical region or type of industry? I mean, you sort of alluded to it earlier on, but I'm interested to know whether maybe some companies have got slightly different messaging in some markets than others, if that's even possible these days.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there has to be that nuance, and you have to be market specific. Just because something is happening in quite a dominant market, it doesn't always translate across different jurisdictions, different kinds of legislation, but also different consumer and employee expectations as well. I think we are seeing, financial institutions definitely modifying sustainability efforts and climate commitments, particularly in line with their own investor expectations. And in general, there has been more complexity and uncertainty just because there'll be an announcement and then it will change, and something else by the end of the day will be dominating the news cycle. So this kind of regulatory uncertainty, I don't think, is helping. But whilst clearly the main impact of this would be for a domestic organization in the US, if you have contradicting standards in different markets, that clearly creates internal tensions for multinationals in terms of what they must adhere to in the US and what is expected elsewhere. And then also public is in a different place in different markets. Our recent Edelman Trust Barometer in the UK showed that 72% of respondents believe that businesses should be doing more to tackle climate change, but only 39% trust companies to follow through on sustainability commitments, showing that there is a bit of a communication challenge, a bit of a say-do gap on this issue. So just because the legislation in America, driven by the American presidency, is in one place, it doesn't mean that it's carrying people with it. So the companies that we advise do have to clearly think about their consumers and also their workforce and how they would feel about these things. And getting that right is not straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, it kind of brings us back to something that in the age of polarized political environments, how difficult it is to look as though you're taking any one side politically. And although there seems to be this big sort of swing towards being pro the Trump agenda, that's definitely something that can have a lot of downsides, given the US is a very divided country, and let's face it, every country is a divided country at the moment.
Definitely. But I think businesses are quite nimble and quite agile. And a lot of these things were signposted in the campaign and before the campaign. So I think people will be pricing in and expecting a fair bit of this.
I agree. I mean, I think businesses are having to be very pragmatic in terms of how they communicate and the messages they put out. And if you're a business that has a lot of expert sports work to the US, if you're relying on US investment, then you're clearly going to have to take a very nuanced view on what you say about ESG. I mean, I think the key thing is you have to be absolutely clear on what your strategy is, because, you are never going to be able to please all people all the time at the moment. So you need to be very clear on what it is you're trying to achieve, and then make sure that you're framing it in the right way in each individual market.
Good advice. So I wanted to move on to the S of ESG. I mean, as I mentioned, the DEI rollback has been well documented, but it'd be good to sort of get your perspectives on it, really. What do you make of how the rollback has been communicated so far by big corporations?
I think on the whole that corporates who have rolled back on DEI have broadly been quite transparent on what they're doing. And if you are going to roll back on DEI, I think you have no option but to be transparent, because we are surrounded, all of us, by scrutiny, by activists. You cannot do these things in secret. What I would say is I think any organisation thinking about rolling back on it needs to be very, very careful about why they're doing it, and need to ask the question, what is it you're trying to achieve? Because actually, while rolling back on DEI might please certain people on the right of the political spectrum, it's not going to please an awful lot of your employees. The corporates have done an awful lot of work in this global fight for talent to try and make their organisations more reflective of the world around them, to give greater opportunity and all the rest of it. And particularly with a lot of younger people and people of my age as well, working for an organisation that actually is fair, decent, and reflects your own values is still a huge attraction. But I think it's quite interesting. The FT published quite an interesting story yesterday where they looked at the annual reports for big US corporates post Trump's election and compared them to what they said last year. And I think it showed about 90% of them had weakened their language on DEI. So, it is clearly a massive issue. It's clearly something that's going to be continuing. But I think our advice to any corporate is be very clear on why you're doing it, because while it may seem like a smart idea right now, it's pretty unlikely to seem a smart idea in 5 to 10 years' time.
Good advice. Mo, what do you think? What have you made of how big firms have communicated their DEI or lack of?
Yeah, look, I think businesses face a bit of a trust paradox when it comes to DE&I. It's something that we looked at again in our trust barometer, and the majority of respondents, and certainly from a UK perspective, believe that companies should promote diversity and inclusion, but actually only 40% trust businesses to do that fairly. And so you have this sense that sometimes there are organizations that are perceived as using D&I more for PR purposes rather than for genuine change. And that really drives down that trust and the point of doing it. So I think the outcome here needs to be that companies are transparent and measurable rather than symbolic in what they are doing on this agenda, and also not just talking about it, but integrating it authentically into culture, into structure, into leadership, rather than treating it as an external marketing tool, creating clearer governance policies and commitments that promote equity without this sense of perceived bias. So I think if that's happening around people being transparent, data-driven, then I think that works. Also engaging meaningfully rather than just reactively, not only speaking up on D&I when there's a crisis. These feel like sensible things to be doing. And if there is a rollback, I think really examining when you're reviewing these initiatives, what is the purpose of them and are you reframing them? Are they genuinely there to make a positive change within your organization, or is there another reason why you have taken that? So I think for organizations, it's better that they tell their story in terms of if they want to roll back, are they reviewing and trying to overhaul their D&I programs rather than just cutting them for the sake of it? And are they looking at how these initiatives can make positive change and create kind of fairer, more equitable workplaces? I think that would take away from the sense of skepticism, perhaps, and mistrust, where people see these initiatives as part of a say-do gap, where companies promote D&I publicly, but then fail to take real action internally.
I think it's a good point. I mean, there's an argument to say that actually this sort of approach by the Trump presidency could move out those companies that are doing DEI in a kind of superficial way, really, that actually, if you were doing DEI properly, then you can't just, flick a switch and you're no longer doing it if it's really embedded in your organization. So that's it's an interesting aspect, really, I think. And another part of this is there have been some big companies that have gone out of their way to emphasize that they're sticking by their DEI commitments. What do you make of that? It strikes me on the one hand ostensibly it's a slightly short-term risky thing to do, but at the same time, they can get a lot of kudos for doing it. And maybe in the long term, it is a better strategy.
I think it comes down to, as you say, to strategy. What, is this important? Why is it important? And there definitely have been examples of big businesses that have stepped up or stayed the course. I think both Apple and JP Morgan said they weren't going to roll back. I think Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, when asked what he was going to do when he got activists crawling all over the business, said, bring it on, which is a very authentic response. And, I would say is if it was worth doing in the first place, then it probably is still worth doing. I would encourage corporates not to bend to short-term political whim unless they are absolutely clear that it wasn't the right thing to do in the first place, in which case you need to backfill with something credible and tangible that is going to explain what your worldview is and why people should trust you. And just rolling back on policies that you've made a lot of noise about in the past is not going to equate to a trusted brand or a belief in your brand and your purpose.
Just to come in on that, I agree. I think, companies that are already doing this, but doing it in a way that it is transparent, it is measurable, and it's outcome driven. That is the key thing, rather than it just being symbolic, because there's a risk of almost reacting because the Trump administration has put down these diktats and these executive orders. And the more that you integrate this into, as we were saying before, culture, into structure, into leadership, rather than just seeing it as some kind of external facing lens or marketing tool, creating that clearer governance internally, really, really closing that say-do gap makes it a genuine thing. And I think that has real impact with your employees, your workforce, and also your consumers as well. And those actions, I think, they become a part of a business strategy, and they outlast any kind of regulation or regulatory or presidential timeframe as well, which is really important.
Yeah, it's a good point. And actually, you mentioned internal comms there. I mean, this must be a colossal internal comms challenge for a lot of organisations. Have you sort of spoken to your clients or others in your businesses about internal comms in relation to this and what that sort of challenge is like at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we advise clients on kind of workplace advisory and internal comms, and these issues are coming up. Within the first few days just of the new presidency, there were hundreds of executive orders. There were lots of things around business and compliance that people have to follow. So there is tracking that, but I think there's also an element of being able to cut through the noise and understanding the politics behind these things, and actually what really businesses should be focusing on and what they can leave or maybe come back to, like what are the real expectations and the principles behind them, rather than every day we have to do something else, we have to do something new, because that becomes unsustainable for most organizations, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess inevitably there'll be some clients though that are going to be rolling back and have been rolling back their DEI commitments. I mean, in that scenario, is there any recommendation you would give for how you might handle that from a comms perspective?
I would say extremely carefully. I think, when you roll it all the way back, the pressure and the scrutiny that DE&I and ESG is under at the moment, do I personally welcome it? No, I don't. But equally, if something is worth having and worth doing, you should be able to defend it. So I think if corporates are being forced to step back and reappraise why they're doing these things and why it matters, they should be able to make a solid case for it. And if they're looking to roll back DEI, as I said earlier, my big question would be, why are you doing it and why are you doing it now? Because it clearly has to be something that you believed in and were committed to in the first place. And if that isn't the case, then frankly, you need to go out and you need to be transparent about it, and you need to expect that you're going to get heavily criticised. Again, I would suggest that organisations look 5, 10, 15 years into the future and ask themselves the question, why would anyone want to work for us? What are our values? What's our culture? What's our view of the world? Why are we a decent organisation that people want to partner with? And the questions that come back from that have to stand up to scrutiny, and they have to stand up to a change in political view, which will inevitably come. Maybe not for some years, maybe not for some decades, but it will come.
to add to that, I mean, I think we're already seeing this DEI hushing idea. Certainly in America, lots of US companies seem to remove reference to this from the annual reports and are not talking about it in the same way. But this is also about audiences. So yes, you have your policy maker audience and you have the government who are making these rules, but then you do also have your investors, you have your workforce, and you have your consumers, and they're not often in the same place on a lot of things, frankly, but certainly I think on this. And you're already seeing a bit of a backlash from consumers as well. In the States, certain companies being boycotted, people changing their shopping habits. So I think as a company, you do have to weigh up at a very senior level all of these audiences. And of course, you want to be compliant with whatever the law is. You want to avoid investigation, in this case, from federal agencies in the US. But you do have to think of the longer game and think about the other audiences that do effectively work for or sustain your business. And of course, that is difficult, that is challenging, it needs careful navigation. Some things you might want to do slightly more internally or privately within your organization rather than publicly. But I think being able to navigate through and thinking about the impact of all these audiences, you obviously do then influence each other as well, is very important.
Yeah, I was going to talk about DEI hushing actually, because it's something that we touched on in another recent podcast, and it does seem to be increasingly something on the agenda. And you mentioned earlier on about the slight change of language that we're seeing and so on. Do you have any thoughts, Andrew, particularly on DEI hushing and big corporations playing down their efforts?
Well, I mean, I think inevitably we are going to see it from some corporates. And that FT story I mentioned earlier, with 90% of corporates that they looked at in the US reporting since Trump was elected, having changed the language they're using. Not necessarily mean that all of them are hushing. They may just be changing the narrative. But yes, certainly I'm sure a lot of organisations are, as they are with the environment, trying very hard to keep their head below the parapet. I mean, what I would say is I think it's very hard to hush anything these days. You are surrounded by scrutiny, you're surrounded by activists. It's not difficult to find information out about corporates and what they're doing. I think trust is built on transparency and about having a clear goal, clear strategies, and actually delivering against that mission. And I think there is an element of corporates having to own it in the current environment. They either really believe in what they're doing and they need to stand up and make the case afresh, or if they're going to back down, then that is clearly their decision, but they will get criticised for it, and they need to frame it in through the lens of how their brand is going to be seen in the future.
I mean, one thing to say is the investment community's move away from ESG has been really notable. According to the Association of Investment Companies' annual ESG attitudes tracker, in October 2024, just 48% of private investors said they consider ESG when investing. That was down from 53% in 2023 and 66% in 2021, which was probably a high point. Can we expect this trend to continue? And do you have any other thoughts on this trend?
I think to an extent, yes, we can expect it to continue because it tracks investor sentiment. I think tracks the wider political and policy environment, and this predates clearly the new US administration. I think there has been more questioning and more scrutiny around ESG and around net zero commitments across many different markets by many different governments, both of the centre left and the centre right, because people are prioritising cost of living issues and the impact that extra costs will have on voters, stroke consumers. So that is not surprising. But then I also think there is a baseline here as well, just because of what's happening in the US with quite strong moves away from this agenda. You have to think about, if you're a multinational organization, that there are different expectations and different legislation in other countries, other markets, other regions. So as a business, you can't just shut down a program outside of the US in the same way, because you will face much more resistance from the regulation of the markets, but also, I think, workforce and consumers. And again, the investor community does need to think about the impact on consumers as well. And you still have a situation where I think a significant number of consumers do want to see action on these agendas from businesses and other institutions. So again, it's a difficult balancing act. So whilst it may go down, I don't think it will diminish entirely.
Interesting. And Andrew, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there's a difference between the retail and the institutional investor view on this as well. So, I mean, the whole sort of woke capitalism movement obviously isn't new. The argument put across was that ESG funds constrained investment after Russia invaded Ukraine and the oil stocks went through the roof, and therefore a lot of Trump supporters did not like ESG funds for that reason. I think that is a trend that we are going to see continuing, although ironically, when you actually drill down into some of these ESG funds and you actually look at the individual assets they're invested in, a lot of them are the sort of Magnificent Seven, and they're big international businesses which are, listed in London or New York or wherever, and they have to report to ESG standards anyway. So what is an ESG fund versus not an ESG fund is quite an interesting question, I think. But when you look at institutional investors, research that we've done for various clients shows very clearly that there is a strong appetite still to invest in green assets and in the green economy. And that actually isn't driven by a desire to be woke or green or any of these other things that might be thrown at institutional investors. It's driven by the fact that they recognise it's good business and that actually renewable energy is now the cheapest source of energy. So investing into renewable assets makes sense, and that we are seeing a transition in business and economies that is requiring different types of investments in different technologies and different assets. So actually the view that you get on ESG from institutions and retails is often quite different. But certainly the retail investments stats that you refer to, I think, unfortunately do paint a picture of where that market is heading at the moment.
Yeah, and do you have any other predictions on ESG throughout the rest of 2025 that you'd like to share?
I mean, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for businesses and regulators and politicians, investors. I think that the pressure is not going to go away. I think the interesting thing is going to see what, particularly on the environment, how that plays out. We've got COP30 at the end of this year, which will be in Brazil. The Brazilians are very keen to focus attention on nature, on the Amazonian rainforest, on driving a sustainable transition through the whole world economy. That requires money. Is that money on board? We've got all these challenges with GFANs and with some of these other global financial institutions who are recalibrating what they stand for and how they come to market. That is not going to go away. So I think it is going to be increasingly difficult. I think the light at the end of the tunnel is that consumers and investors and other businesses are still expecting business to be green, to be sustainable, to be socially responsible, because they recognise that the long-term trends point in that direction. It is going to be a year of rebalancing, and corporates are going to have to be very careful about how they reset strategy, what they keep and what they throw out, and they need to look towards the long term.
Great, thank you. And Mo, any other thoughts?
I think broadly the framing and the language of this is going to change, moving away from the idea of social justice or green transition, much more to business performance, business efficiencies and effectiveness, and looking at it. And you're already seeing this to an extent in many different markets, looking at sustainability agenda more through the prisms of the economy, through job creation, through prosperity, through skills, through regional development. And I think those feel like politically safer things to be talking about, where you can address the same issues, frankly, but just talk about them slightly differently. So we may hear less of the phrasing that we've all become used to, and more of this different kind of framing, and possibly a bit more introspection from organizations and companies as well, in terms of why they are doing what they are doing, which of the initiatives that they really want to get behind, and what is the impact on, as we have been saying, workforce, investors and consumers as well. And I think the other trend may well be that you move away from the world of top-down diktats from regulation and from politicians, and actually more action-driven by organizations themselves that is not mandated, but it's where they feel comfortable and where they feel the balance that they've got is right amongst all the different audiences that they are working with. So even if the regulation is in one place, they may go beyond that out of choice, but in a way that works for them. And I think that drive where they're doing it rather than having things being done to them is a trend that we will see more and more of.
Fascinating. Thank you. Before we go, I thought, as I mentioned at the top, I'd ask about tariffs. Obviously, Trump's huge import tariffs imposed on a number of countries, and what we expect is a big trade war coming is causing a big headache for a lot of companies. Could either of you give any sort of comms advice that you'd look to give to any clients that are being affected or could potentially be affected by the trade war?
I would say what we kind of hear about or read in the morning often changes by the afternoon in this issue. So maybe don't be too quick to react at the first thing you see. Yes, this is high politics and high geopolitics, but it has a real impact on businesses, on consumers, and on people that all of our clients and organizations we work for interact with and employ. But I think it's also quite telling if you look at beyond the kind of personality politics that this comes across. I think it goes beyond, well, the president likes this person or likes this country, so they'll be fine. And actually really looking at things like surplus and deficits between the two countries on trade, considering what the impact is on your supply chains, where they are, looking at the fact that he seems more focused on goods, not services. So all of these things, I think, point to taking a bit of a step back, engaging with the policymakers in various markets to see where they are at in the more behind the scenes conversations, and not being too quick to react to the first headline, because often that will change and something that you think is happening will be called off at the last minute because actually there are developments that may be a bit more behind the scenes.
Thank you. And Andrew, final thoughts on tariffs and the comms challenge there?
I would totally agree with Mo on that. My advice would be don't poke the bear. This is a big negotiating strategy. I think corporates need to pause and see how it falls out. And I would be very cautious about saying anything publicly on it. I think behind the scene negotiations is the way forward until you're very clear on what is going to be happening.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for this discussion. Obviously, a huge amount of things we have discussed and we could continue to discuss, and no doubt we will be returning to it soon. But for now, thank you so much, Mo and Andrew, for taking part and for your insights. Okay, if you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. So until next time, thank you for listening and goodbye.